7:30 a.m. It was now 7:30. The battle had been in progress nearly 3 hours, and Hooker's attack had been repulsed. But fresh troops were coming into action from the north and northeast, and Lawton's and Jones's divisions were in no condition to withstand a renewed assault. No less than 3 officers in succession had led the latter. Not one single brigade in either division was still commanded by the officer who brought it into action, and but few regiments. Of 4,200 infantry, 1,700 had already fallen. Never had Jackson's soldiers displayed a spirit more akin to that of their intrepid leader, and their fierce courage was not to be wasted. Reinforcements were close at hand. Early's brigade, 100 strong, was moving across from Nicodemus Run into the West Wood. Hood brought his Texans, 800 muskets, to the relief of Lawton, and on Hood's right, but facing eastward, for Ricketts was working round Jackson's right, 3 of D.H. Hill's brigades, hitherto hidden under cover, came rapidly into line. Lawton's division, nearly half the command being killed or wounded, was withdrawn to the Dunkard Church, but on the skirt of the West Wood, the heroic remnant of the Valley regiments still held fast among the limestone ledges. The 8,500 infantry which McClellan had sent to Hooker's assistance formed the 12th Army Corps, commanded by Mansfield, and with those men too Jackson's soldiers were well acquainted. They were the men who had followed Banks and Shields from Kernstown to Winchester, from Port Republic to Cedar Run, and the Valley Army had not yet encountered more determined foes. Their attack was delivered with their wonted vigour. Several regiments, moving west of the turnpike, bore down on the West Wood. But coming into action at considerable intervals, they were roughly handled by Jones's division, now commanded by Colonel Grigsby and protected by the rocks, and Stuart's artillery taking them in flank, they were rapidly dispersed. East of the high road the battle raged with still greater violence. Hood and his Texans, as Lawton's brigades passed to the rear, dashed across the cornfield against Meade and Ricketts, driving back the infantry on the batteries and shooting down the gunners. But the Federal line remained unbroken, and Mansfield's troops were already moving forward. Crawford's brigade, and then Gordon's, struck the Texans in front, while Greene, working round the East Wood, made a resolute onslaught on D.H. Hill. The struggle was long and bloody. The men stood like duellists, firing and receiving the fire at 50 or 100 paces. Crawford lost 1,000 men without gaining a foot of ground. But Gordon turned the scale, and Hood's brigades were gradually forced back through the cornfield to the Dunkard Church. A great gap had now opened in Jackson's line. Jones's division, its flank uncovered by Hood's retreat, found itself compelled to seek a new position. D.H. Hill's brigades, in the same plight, gave ground towards Sharpsburg, and Greene, following in pursuit, actually crossed the turnpike and penetrated the West Wood, but neither Hooker nor Mansfield were able to support him, and unassisted he could make no progress. 9 a.m. At this moment, as if by common consent, the firing ceased on this flank of the battle, and as McClellan's 2nd Army Corps, led by Sumner, advanced to sustain the 1st and 12th, we may stand by Jackson near the Dunkard Church and survey the field after 4 hours fighting. Assailed in front by superior numbers and enfiladed by the batteries beyond the Antietam, the Confederate left had everywhere given back. The East Wood was in possession of the enemy. Their right occupied the Miller House. Their centre, supported by many batteries, stood across the cornfield, while the left, thrust forward, was actually established on the edge of the West Wood, some 500 yards to northward of the church. But if Jackson had yielded ground, he had exacted a fearful price. The space between the woods was a veritable slaughter pen, reeking under the hot September sun, where the blue uniforms lay thicker than the grey. The 1st Army Corps had been cut to pieces. It had been beaten in fair fight by Jackson's 2 divisions, counting at the outset less than half its numbers, and aided only by the cavalry. It had lost in killed and wounded over 100 officers and 2,400 men. Hooker himself had been struck down, and as far as the Antietam the field was covered with his stragglers. the 12th Corps had suffered hardly less severely, and Mansfield himself, an old man and a gallant soldier, was dying of his wounds. His batteries indeed remained in action, pouring shot and shell on the West Wood and the Dunkard Church, but his infantry, reduced by more than 1,500 rifles, could do no more than hold their ground. Nor was the exhaustion of the enemy the only advantage which the Confederates had gained by the slaughter of 4,000 men. The position to which Jackson had retired was more favourable than that from which he had been driven. The line, no longer presenting a weak angle, was almost straight, and no part of the front was open to enfilade. Stuart and his artillery, withdrawn to a more favourable position, secured the left. D.H. Hill on the right, though part of his force had given way, still held the Roulette House and the sunken road, and the troops in the West Wood were well protected from the northern batteries. The one weak point was the gap occupied by Greene's Federals, which lay between Grigsby's regiments in the northern angle of the West Wood and Hood's division at the Dunkard Church. The enemy, however, showed no signs of making good his opportunity. Early's brigade was close at hand, and Lee had promised further reinforcements. A glance southward showed that there was no reason for despair. Over all the field lay the heavy smoke of a great artillery battle. From near the Dunkard Church to the bluff overhanging the Antietam, a distance of 2 miles, battery on battery was in line. Here were Longstreet's artillery under Stephen Lee, together with the 26 guns of Cutts' Reserve Battalion, 48 guns in all, the divisional batteries of D.H. Hill, and the Washington Artillery of New Orleans, and in addition to these 80 guns, others were in action above the Burnside Bridge. An array even more formidable crowned the opposite crest, but although the Confederate batteries, opposed by larger numbers and heavier metal, had suffered terribly, both in men and in material, yet the infantry, the main strength of the defence, was still intact. The cliffs of the Red Hill, replying to the rolling thunder of near 800 guns, gave back no echo to the sharper crack of musketry. Save a few skirmishers who had crossed the Sharpsburg Bridge, not one company of McClellan's infantry had been sent into action south of the Dunkard Church. Beyond the Antietam, covering the whole space between the river and the hills, the blue masses were plainly to be seen through the drifting smoke, some so far in the distance that only the flash of steel in the bright sunshine distinguished them from the surrounding woods, others moving in dense columns towards the battle, standards on standards, men on men, in slow succession still. But neither by the Sharpsburg nor yet by the Burnside Bridge had a single Federal regiment crossed the stream. Lee's centre and right were not even threatened, and it was evident his reserves might be concentrated without risk at whatever point he pleased. Walker's division was therefore withdrawn from the right, and McLaws, who had reached Sharpsburg shortly after sunrise, was ordered to the front. G. T. Anderson's brigade was detached from D.H. Hill, and the whole force was placed at Jackson's disposal. These fresh troops, together with Early's regiments, not yet engaged, gave 10,000 muskets for the counterstroke, and had Hooker and Mansfield been alone upon the field, the Federal right wing would have been annihilated. But as the Confederate reserves approached the Dunkard Church, Sumner, whom McClellan had ordered to cross Prize Bridge with the 2nd Army Corps, threw 3 divisions against the West Wood and the Roulette House. In 3 lines, up the slope from the Antietam, at 60 yards distance and covering a wide front, came Sedgwick on the right, French on the left, and Richardson to the left rear. So orderly was the advance of those 18,000 Northerners, and so imposing their array, that even the Confederate officers watched their march with admiration, and terrible was the shock with which they renewed the conflict. Sedgwick, emerging from the East Wood, moved directly over the cornfield, crossed the turnpike, and entering the West Wood to northward of the point still held by Greene, swept through the timber, and with a portion of his advanced brigade reached the further edge. Greene, at the same moment, moved upon the Dunkard Church, and Early, who with the fragments of Jones' division was alone within the wood, marched rapidly in the same direction. Attacked suddenly in flank from behind a ridge of rock, Greene's regiments were driven back, and then Early, observing Sedgwick's third line pushing across the turnpike, reformed his troops for further action. Greene, for the moment, had been disposed of, but a more formidable attack was threatening. Sedgwick's 6,000 muskets, confronted only by some 6,001 of the Valley soldiers under Grigsby, were thronging through the wood, and a change of front southward would have sent them sweeping down the Confederate line. Early could hardly have withstood their onset. Hood was incapable of further effort, and D.H. Hill was heavily pressed by French. But Jackson's hand still held the reins of battle. During the fierce struggle of the morning he had remained on the edge of the West Wood, leaving, as was his wont, the conduct of the divisions to his subordinates, but watching his enemy with a glance that saw beyond the numbers arrayed against him. He had already demanded reinforcements from General Lee, and in anticipation of their speedy arrival their orders had been already framed. They had not been called for to sustain his front or to occupy a new position. Despite the thronging masses of the Federals, despite the fact that his line was already broken, attack, and attack only, was in Jackson's mind, and the reserves and the opportunity arrived together. A staff officer was dispatched to direct Walker on the left to sustain the Texans, to clear the West Wood, and to place a detachment in the gap between the Dunkard Church and the batteries of Colonel Lee, while Jackson himself, riding to meet McLaws, ordered him to drive the enemy back and turn his right. Anderson's brigade was sent to support McLaws, and Semmy's brigade of McLaws' division was detached to strengthen Stuart. Forming into line as they advanced, McLaws and Walker, leaving the Dunkard Church on their right and moving swiftly through the wood, fell suddenly on Sedgwick's flank. Early joined in the melee, and the result, says Palfrey, a Northern general who was present on the field, was not long doubtful. Sedgwick's fine division was at the mercy of their enemy. Change of front was impossible. In less time than it takes to tell it, the ground was strewn with the bodies of the dead and wounded, while the unwounded were moving off rapidly to the north. Nearly 2,000 men were disabled in a moment. And the impetus of the counterstroke was not yet spent. Gordon's brigade of the 12th Corps had been dispatched to Sedgwick's help, but McLaws had reformed his troops, and after a short struggle the Confederates drove all before them. Confusion reigned supreme in the Federal ranks. In vain their powerful artillery, firing case and canister with desperate energy, strove to arrest the rush of the pursuing infantry. Out from the West Wood and across the cornfield the grey lines of battle, preceded by clouds of skirmishers, pressed forward without a check, and the light batteries, plying whip and spur, galloped to the front in close support. Hope rose high. The Southern yell, pealing from 10,000 throats, rang with a wild note of anticipated triumph, and Jackson, riding with McLaws, followed with kindling gaze the progress of his counterstroke attack. "God," he said to his companion, as the shells fell round them and the masses of the enemy melted away like the morning mist, "has been very kind to us this day." But the end was not yet. Sedgwick's brigades, flying to the northeast, rallied under the fire of their batteries, and as the Confederates advanced upon the East Wood, they found it already occupied by a fresh brigade. Smith's division of the 6th Corps had been sent forward by McClellan to sustain the battle, and its arrival saved his army from defeat. Once more the cornfield became the scene of a furious struggle, the Southerners fighting for decisive victory, the Federals for existence. So impetuous was McLaws's attack that the regiments on his left, although checked by the fences, drove in a battery and dashed back the enemy's first line. But the weight of the artillery in front of the North Wood, supported by a portion of Smith's division, prevented further advance, and a Federal brigade, handled with rare judgment, rushed forward to meet the assailants in the open. Sharp was the conflict, for McLaws, a fine soldier, as daring as he was skilful, strove fiercely to complete the victory. But the fight within the woods and the swift pursuit had broken the order of his division. Brigade had mingled with brigade, regiment with regiment. There were no supports, and the broken ranks, scourged by the terrible crossfire of many batteries, were unable to withstand the solid impact of the Federal reserve. Slowly and sullenly the troops fell back from the deadly strife. The enemy, no less exhausted, halted, and lay down beyond the turnpike, and while the musketry once more died away to northward of the Dunkard church, Jackson, rallying his brigades, re-established his line along the edge of the West Wood. Near the church was a portion of Walker's division. Further north were two of McLaw's brigades, then Armistead, who had been sent forward from Sharpsburg, and then Early. A brigade of McLaw's division formed the second line, and Anderson was sent back to D.H. Hill. Hood also was withdrawn, and the survivors of Jones's division, many of whom had shared in the counterattack, were permitted to leave the front. 10:30 a.m. Their rifles were no longer needed, for from 10:30 onwards, so far as the defence of the Confederate left was concerned, the work was done. For many hours, the West Wood was exposed to the concentrated fire of the Federal artillery, but this fire, although the range was close, varying from 6 to 1,500 yards, had little effect. The shattered branches fell incessantly among the recumbent ranks, and the shells, exploding in the foliage, sent their hissing fragments far and wide. Yet the losses, so more than one general reported, were surprisingly small. But although the enemy's infantry had been repulsed, no immediate endeavour was made by the Confederates to initiate a fresh counterstroke. When Lee sent McLaws and Walker to Jackson's aid, he sent in his last reserve, for A.P. Hill had not yet reached the field, and R.H. Anderson's division had already been taken to support the centre. Thus no fresh troops were available, and the Federal right was strong. At least 15 batteries of artillery were in position along the edge of the North Wood, and they were powerfully supported by the heavy guns beyond the stream. Yet the infantry so effectively protected was only formidable by reason of its numbers. The 1st Corps and the 12th no longer existed as organised bodies. Sedgwick's division of the 2nd Corps was still more shattered. Only Smith's division was effective, and General McClellan, acting on the advice of Sumner, forbade all further attack. Slocum's division of the 6th Corps, which reached the East Wood at 12 o'clock, was ordered to remain in rear as support to Smith. The Confederate left wing, then, had offered such strenuous resistance that 8 divisions of infantry, more than half of McClellan's army, lay paralysed before them for the remainder of the day. 30,500 infantry, at the lowest calculation, and probably 100 guns, besides those across the Antietam, had been massed by the Federals in this quarter of the field. Jackson's numbers, even after he had been reinforced by McLaws and Walker, at no time approached those arrayed against him, and 19,400 men, including Stuart and 3 brigades of Hill and 40 guns, is a liberal estimate of his strength. The losses on both sides had been exceedingly heavy. Nearly 13,000 men, including no less than 15 generals and brigadiers, had fallen within 6 hours. But although the Confederate casualties were not greatly exceeded by those of the enemy, and were much larger in proportion to their strength, the Federals had lost more than mere numbers. The moral of the troops had suffered, and still more the moral of the leaders. Even Sumner, bravest of men, had been staggered by the fierce assault which had driven Sedgwick's troops like sheep across the cornfield, nor was McClellan disposed to push matters to extremity. Over in the West Wood, on the other hand, discouragement had no place. Jackson had not yet abandoned hope of sweeping the enemy from the field. He was disappointed with the partial success of McLaws's counterstroke. It had come too late. The fortuitous advance of Smith's division, at the very crisis of the struggle, had, in all human probability, rescued the Federal right from a terrible defeat. Had McLaws been able to reach the East Wood, he would have compelled the hostile batteries to retreat. The Federal infantry, already shattered and disorganized, could hardly have held on, and the line would have been broken through. But although one opportunity had been lost, and he was once more thrown on the defensive, Jackson's determination to make the battle decisive of the war was still unshaken. His judgment was never clearer. Shortly before 11 o'clock, his medical director, appalled by the number of wounded men sent back from the front, and assured that the day was going badly, rode to the West Wood in order to discuss the advisability of transferring the field hospitals across the Potomac. Dr. Maguire found Jackson sitting quietly on Little Sorrel behind the line of battle, and some peaches he had brought with him were gratefully accepted. He then made his report, and his apprehensions were not made less by the weakness of the line which held the wood. The men, in many places, were lying at intervals of several yards. For support there was but one small brigade, and over in the cornfields the overwhelming strength of the Federal masses was terribly apparent. Yet his imperturbable commander, apparently paying more attention to the peaches than to his subordinates' suggestions, replied by pointing to the enemy and saying quietly, "Dr. Maguire, they have done their worst." Meanwhile, the tide of battle, leaving Jackson's front and setting strongly southwards, threatened to submerge the Confederate centre. French's division of Sumner's corps, 2 brigades of Franklin's, and afterwards Richardson's division, made repeated efforts to seize the Dunkard Church, the Roulette Farm, and the Piper House. At 1 p.m. the battle raged fiercely about the sunken road which was held by D.H. Hill, and which witnessed on this day such preeminence of slaughter that it has since been known by the name of the Bloody Lane. Here, inspired by the unyielding courage of their leaders, fought the 5 brigades of D.H. Hill, with B.H. Anderson's division and 2 of Walker's regiments, and here Longstreet, confident as always, controlled the battle with his accustomed skill. The Confederate artillery was by this time overpowered, for on each battery in turn the enemy's heavy ordnance had concentrated an overwhelming fire, and the infantry were supported by no more than a dozen guns. The attack was strong, but the sunken road, fortified by piles of fence rails, remained inviolable. Still, the Confederate losses were enormous, and defeat appeared a mere question of time. At one moment the enemy under French had actually seized the wood near the Dunkard Church, and was only dispossessed by a desperate counterstroke. Richardson, who advanced on French's right, and at an appreciable interval of time, was even more successful than his colleague. The Bloody Lane, already piled with dead and enfiladed from a height to the northwest, was carried by a brilliant charge, and when the Roulette Farm, a strong defensive post, was stormed, Longstreet fell back to the turnpike through the wreck of the artillery. But at this critical juncture the Federals halted. They had not been supported by their batteries. Richardson had received a mortal wound, and a succession of rough counterstrokes had thinned their ranks. Here, too, the musketry dwindled to a spattering fire, and the opposing forces, both reduced to the defensive, lay watching each other through the long hours of the afternoon. A threat of a Federal advance from the Sharpsburg Bridge came to nothing. 4 batteries of regulars, preceded by a force of infantry, pushed across the stream and came into action on either side of the Boonesborough Road. But on the slopes above, strongly protected by the walls, Evans's brigade stood fast. Lee sent up a small support, and the enemy confined his movements to a demonstration. Still further to the south, however, the battle blazed out at 1 o'clock with unexpected fury. The Federal attack, recoiling first from Jackson and then from Longstreet, swung round to the Confederate right, and it seemed as if McClellan's plan was to attempt each section of Lee's line in succession. Burnside had been ordered to force the passage of the bridge at 9 o'clock, but either the difficulty of the task or his inexperience in handling troops on the offensive delayed his movements, and when the attack was made, it was fiercely met by 4 Confederate brigades. At length, well on in the afternoon, 3 Federal divisions crowned the spur, and driving Longstreet's right before them, made good their footing on the ridge. Sharpsburg was below them. The Southern infantry, outflanked and roughly handled, was falling back in confusion upon the town, and although Lee had assembled a group of batteries in the centre, and regiments were hurrying from the left, disaster seemed imminent. But strong assistance was at hand. A.P. Hill, who had forded the Potomac and crossed the Antietam by the lower bridge, after a forced march of 17 miles in 8 hours from Harper's Ferry, attacked without waiting for orders, and struck the Federals in flank with 3,000 bayonets. By this brilliant counterstroke, Burnside was repulsed, and the position saved. Northern writers have laid much stress on this attack. Had Burnside displayed more, or A.P. Hill less, energy, the Confederates, they assert, could hardly have escaped defeat. It is certainly true that Longstreet's 4 brigades had been left to bear the brunt of Burnside's assault without further support than could be rendered by the artillery. They were not so left, however, because it was impossible to aid them. Jackson's and Longstreet's troops, despite the fiery ordeal through which they had passed, were not yet powerless, and the Confederate leaders were prepared for offensive tactics. A sufficient force to sustain the right might have been withdrawn from the left and centre, but Hill's approach was known, and it was considered inadvisable to abandon all hold of the means for a decisive counterstroke on the opposite flank. Early in the afternoon, Longstreet had given orders for an advance. Hood's division, with full cartridge boxes, had reappeared upon the field. Jones's and Lawton's divisions were close behind. The batteries had replenished their ammunition, and if Longstreet was hardly warranted in arranging a general counterattack on his own responsibility, he had at least full confidence in the ability of the troops to execute it. It seemed probable, he says, that by concealing our movements under cover of the West Wood, we could draw our columns so near to the enemy to the front that we would have but a few rods to march to mingle our ranks with his, that our columns, massed in goodly numbers and pressing heavily upon a single point, would give the enemy much trouble and might cut him in two, breaking up his battle arrangements at Burnside Bridge. The stroke against the centre was not, however, to be tried. Lee had other views, and Jackson had been already ordered to turn the Federal right. Stuart, reinforced by a regiment of infantry and several light batteries, was instructed to reconnoitre the enemy's position, and if favourable ground were found, he was to be supported by all the infantry available. About 12:30, says General Walker, I sought Jackson to report that from the front of my position in the wood, I thought I had observed a movement of the enemy, as if to pass through the gap where I had posted Colonel Cook's 2 regiments. I found Jackson in rear of Barksdale's brigade, under an apple tree, sitting on his horse, with one leg thrown carelessly over the pommel of his saddle, plucking and eating the fruit. Without making any reply to my report, he asked me abruptly, "Can you spare me a regiment and a battery?" Adding that he wished to make up, from the different commands on our left, a force of 4,000 or 5,000 men, and give them to Stuart, with orders to turn the enemy's right and attack him in the rear, that I must give orders to my division to advance to the front, and attack the enemy as soon as I should hear Stuart's guns, and that our whole left wing would move to the attack at the same time. Then, replacing his foot in the stirrup, he said with great emphasis, "We'll drive McClellan into the Potomac." Returning to my command, I repeated General Jackson's order to my brigade commanders, and directed them to listen to the sound of Stuart's guns. We all confidently expected to hear the welcome sound by 2 o'clock at least, and as that hour approached, every ear was on the alert. Napoleon at Waterloo did not listen more intently for the sound of Grouchy's fire than did we for Stuart's. 2 o'clock came, but nothing was heard of Stuart. 2:30 and then 3, and still Stuart made no sign. About 3:30, a staff officer of General Longstreet's brought me an order to advance and attack the enemy in my front. As the execution of this order would have materially interfered with Jackson's plans, I thought it my duty before beginning the movement to communicate with General Longstreet personally. I found him in rear of the position in which I had posted Cook in the morning, and upon informing him of Jackson's intentions, he withdrew his order. While we were discussing this subject, Jackson himself joined us with the information of Stuart's failure to turn the Federal right, for the reason that he found it securely posted on the Potomac. Upon my expressing surprise at this statement, Jackson replied that he also had been surprised, as he had supposed the Potomac much further away, but he remarked that Stuart had an excellent eye for topography, and it must be as he represented. "It is a great pity," he added, "we should have driven McClellan into the Potomac." That a counterstroke which would have combined a frontal and flank attack would have been the best chance of destroying the Federal army can hardly be questioned. The front so bristled with field artillery, and the ridge beyond the Antietam was so strong in heavier ordnance, that a purely frontal attack, such as Longstreet suggested, was hardly promising, But the dispositions which baffled Stuart were the work of a sound tactician. 30 rifled guns had been assembled in a single battery a mile north of the West Wood, where the Hagerstown Turnpike ascends a commanding ridge, and the broad channel of the Potomac is within 900 yards. Here had rallied such portions of Hooker's army corps as had not dispersed, and here Mansfield's 2 divisions had reformed, and although the infantry could hardly have opposed a resolute resistance, the guns were ready to repeat the lesson of Malvern Hill. Against the rifled pieces, the light Confederate smoothbores were practically useless. Stuart's caution was fully justified, and the sun sank on an indecisive battle. The blessed night came, and brought with it sleep and forgetfulness and refreshment to many. But the murmur of the night wind, breathing over fields of wheat and clover, was mingled with the groans of the countless sufferers of both armies. Who can tell, who can even imagine the horrors of such a night, while the unconscious stars shone above, and the unconscious river went rippling by? Out of 130,000 men upon the ground, 21,000 had been killed or wounded, more than 16%. And 25,000 of the Federals can hardly be said to have been engaged. The losses of the Confederate left have already been enumerated. Those of the centre and the right, although A.P. Hill reported only 350 casualties, had hardly been less severe. In all 9,500 officers and men, 1/4 of the total strength had fallen, and many of the regiments had almost disappeared. The 17th Virginia, for instance, of Longstreet's command, took into battle 9 officers and 46 men. Of these 7 officers and 24 men were killed or wounded, and 10 taken prisoners, leaving 2 officers and 12 men to represent a regiment which was over 1,000 strong at Bull Run. Yet as the men sank down to rest on the line of battle, so exhausted that they could not be awakened to eat their rations, as the blood cooled and the tension on the nerves relaxed, and even the officers, faint with hunger and sickened with the awful slaughter, looked forward with apprehension to the morrow. From one indomitable heart the hope of victory had not yet vanished. In the deep silence of the night, more oppressive than the stunning roar of battle, Lee, still mounted, stood on the high road to the Potomac, and as general after general rode in wearily from the front, he asked quietly of each, "How is it on your part of the line?" Each told the same tale. Their men were worn out, the enemy's numbers were overwhelming, there was nothing left but to retreat across the Potomac before daylight. Even Jackson had no other counsel to offer. His report was not the less impressive for his quiet and respectful tone. He had had to contend, he said, against the heaviest odds he had ever met. Many of his divisional and brigade commanders were dead or wounded, and his loss had been severe. Hood, who came next, was quite unmanned. He exclaimed that he had no men left. "Great God!" cried Lee, with an excitement he had not yet displayed. "Where is the splendid division you had this morning?" "They are lying on the field where you sent them," was the reply. "For few have straggled. My division has been almost wiped out." After all had given their opinion, there was an appalling silence, which seemed to last for several minutes, and then General Lee, rising erect in his stirrups, said, "Gentlemen, we will not cross the Potomac tonight. You will go to your respective commands, strengthen your lines, send 2 officers from each brigade towards the ford to collect your stragglers and get them up. Many have come in. I have had the proper steps taken to collect all the men who are in the rear. If McClellan wants to fight in the morning, I will give him battle again. Go." Without a word of remonstrance, the group broke up, leaving their great commander alone with his responsibility, and, says an eyewitness, "If I read their faces aright, there was not one but considered that General Lee was taking a fearful risk." So the soldiers' sleep was undisturbed. Through the September night they lay beside their arms, and from the dark spaces beyond came the groans of the wounded and the nameless odours of the battlefield. Not often has the night looked down upon a scene more terrible. The moon, rising above the mountains, revealed the long lines of men and guns, stretching far across hill and valley, waiting for the dawn to shoot each other down. and between the armies their dead lay in such numbers as civilized war has seldom seen. So fearful had been the carnage and comprised within such narrow limits that a federal patrol, it is related, passing into the cornfield, where the fighting had been fiercest, believed that they had surprised a whole Confederate brigade. There, in the shadow of the woods, lay the skirmishers, their muskets beside them, and there, in regular ranks, lay the line of battle, sleeping, as it seemed, the profound sleep of utter exhaustion. But the first man that was touched was cold and lifeless, and the next, and the next. It was the bivouac of the dead. When the day dawned, the Confederate divisions, reinforced by some 5,000 or 6,000 stragglers, held the same position as the previous evening, and over against them, seen dimly through the mist, lay the Federal lines. The skirmishers, crouching behind the shattered fences, confronted each other at short range. The guns of both armies were unlimbered, and the masses of infantry, further to the rear, lay ready for instant conflict. But not a shot was fired. The sun rose higher in the heavens, the warm breath of the autumn morning rustled in the woods, but still the same strange silence prevailed. The men spoke in undertones, watching intently the movements of staff officers and orderlies. But the ranks lay as still as the inanimate forms, half hidden by the trodden corn, which lay so thickly between the lines. And as the hours passed on without stir or shot, the Southern generals acknowledged that Lee's daring in offering battle was fully justified. The enemy's aggressive strength was evidently exhausted, and then arose the question, could the Confederates attack? It would seem that the possibility of a great counterstroke had already been the subject of debate, and that Lee, despite the failure of the previous evening and Jackson's adverse report, believed that the Federal right might be outflanked and overwhelmed. During the morning, writes General Stephen D. Lee, a courier from headquarters came to my battalion of artillery with a message that the commander-in-chief wished to see me. I followed the courier, and on meeting General Lee, he said, "Colonel Lee, I wish you to go with this courier to General Jackson and say that I sent you to report to him." I replied, "General, shall I take my batteries with me?" He said, "No, just say that I told you to report to him, and he will tell you what he wants." I soon reached General Jackson. He was dismounted, with but few persons round him. He said to me, "Colonel Lee, I wish you to take a ride with me." And we rode to the left of our lines with but one courier, I think. We soon reached a considerable hill and dismounted. General Jackson then said, "Let us go up this hill, and be careful not to expose yourself, for the Federal sharpshooters are not far off." The hill bore evidence of fierce fight the day before. A battery of artillery had been on it, and there were wrecked caissons, broken wheels, dead bodies, and dead horses around. General Jackson said, "Colonel, I wish you to take your glasses and carefully examine the Federal line of battle." I did so, and saw a remarkably strong line of battle, with more troops than I knew General Lee had. After locating the different batteries, unlimbered and ready for action, and noting the strong skirmish line in front of the dense masses of infantry, I said to him, "General, that is a very strong position, and there is a large force there." He said, "Yes, I wish you to take 50 pieces of artillery and crush that force, which is the Federal right. Can you do it?" I can scarcely describe my feelings as I again took my glasses and made an even more careful examination. I waited a good while, with Jackson watching me intently. I said, "General, it cannot be done with 50 guns and the troops you have near here." In an instant he said, "Let us ride back, Colonel." I felt that I had positively shown a lack of nerve, and with considerable emotion begged that I might be allowed to make the attempt, saying, "General, you forced me to say what I did unwillingly. If you give the 50 guns to any other artillery officer, I am ruined for life. I promise you I will fight the guns to the last extremity, if you will only let me command them." Jackson was quiet, seemed sorry for me, and said, "It is all right, Colonel. Everybody knows you are a brave officer and would fight the guns well," or words to that effect. We soon reached the spot from which we started. He said, "Colonel, go to General Lee and tell him what has occurred since you reported to me. Describe our ride to the hill, your examination of the Federal position, and my conversation about your crushing the Federal right with 50 guns, and my forcing you to give your opinion." With feelings such as I never had before, nor ever expect to have again, I returned to General Lee and gave a detailed account of my visit to General Jackson, closing with the account of my being forced to give my opinion as to the possibility of success. I saw a shade come over General Lee's face, and he said, "Colonel, go and join your command." For many years I never fully understood my mission that day, or why I was sent to General Jackson. When Jackson's report was published of the battle, I saw that he stated that on the afternoon of September 17th, General Lee had ordered him to move to the left with a view of turning the Federal right, but that he found the enemy's numerous artillery so judiciously posted in their front and so near the river as to render such an attempt too hazardous to undertake. I afterwards saw General J.E.B. Stewart's report, in which he says that it was determined, the enemy not attacking, to turn the enemy's right on the 18th. It appears General Lee ordered General Jackson on the evening of the 17th to turn the enemy's right, and Jackson said that it could not be done. It also appears from Stewart's report, and from the incident I relate, that General Lee reiterated the order on the 18th and told Jackson to take 50 guns and crush the Federal right. Jackson, having reported against such attempt on the 17th, no doubt said that if an artillerist, in whom General Lee had confidence, would say the Federal right could be crushed with 50 guns, he would make the attempt. I now have the satisfaction of knowing that the opinion which I was forced to give on September 18th had already been given by Jackson on the evening of September 17th, and that the same opinion was reiterated by him on September 18th and confirmed by General J.E.B. Stewart on the same day. I still believe that Jackson, Stewart, and myself were right, and that the attempt to turn the Federal right either on the 17th or on the 18th would have been unwise. The incident shows General Lee's decision and boldness in battle, and General Jackson's delicate loyalty to his commanding general in convincing him of the inadvisability of a proposed movement which he felt it would be hazardous to undertake. The Federal left, protected by the Antietam, was practically inaccessible, and on receiving from the artillery officer's lips the confirmation of Jackson's report, Lee was fain to relinquish all hope of breaking McClellan's line. The troops, however, remained in line of battle, but during the day information came in which made retreat imperative. The Federals were being reinforced. Humphrey's division, hitherto held back at Frederick by orders from Washington, had marched over South Mountain. Couch's division, which McClellan had left to observe Harper's Ferry, had been called in, and a large force of militia was assembling on the Pennsylvania border. Before evening, therefore, Lee determined to evacuate his position, and during the night the Army of Northern Virginia, with all its trains and artillery, recrossed the Potomac at Boteler's Ford. Such was the respect which the hard fighting of the Confederates had imposed upon the enemy, that although the rumbling of heavy vehicles and the tramp of the long columns were so distinctly audible in the Federal lines that they seemed to wakeful ears like the steady flow of a river, not the slightest attempt was made to interfere. It was not till the morning of the 19th that a Federal battalion, reconnoitring towards Sharpsburg, found the ridge and the town deserted. And although Jackson, who was one of the last, except the cavalry scouts, to cross the river, did not reach the Virginia shore till 8 o'clock, not a shot was fired at him. Nor were the trophies gathered by the Federals considerable. Several hundred badly wounded men were found in Sharpsburg, and a number of stragglers were picked up, but neither gun nor wagon had been left upon the field. The retreat, despite many obstacles, was as successfully as skilfully executed. The night was very dark, and a fine rain, which had set in towards evening, soon turned the heavy soil into tenacious mud. The ford was wide and beset with boulders, and the only approach was a narrow lane. But the energetic quartermaster of the Valley Army, Major Harmon, made light of all difficulties, and under the immediate supervision of Lee and Jackson, the crossing was effected without loss or misadventure. Just before nightfall, however, under cover of a heavy artillery fire, the Federals pushed a force of infantry across the ford, drove back the 2 brigades, which, with 30 pieces of artillery, formed the Confederate rearguard, and captured 4 guns. Emboldened by this partial success, McClellan ordered Porter to put 3 brigades of the 5th Army Corps across the river the next morning and reconnoitre towards Winchester. The news of the disaster to his rear guard was long in reaching Lee's headquarters. His army had not yet recovered from the confusion and fatigue of the retreat. The bivouacs of the divisions were several miles from the river and were widely scattered. The generals were ignorant of each other's dispositions. No arrangements had been made to support the rear guard in case of emergency. The greater part of the cavalry had been sent off to Williamsport, 15 miles upstream, with instructions to cross the Potomac and delay the enemy's advance by demonstration. The brigadiers had no orders. Many of the superior generals had not told their subordinates where they would be found, and the commander of the rear guard, General Pendleton, had not been informed of the strength of the infantry placed at his disposal. On the part of the staff, worn out by the toils and anxieties of the past few days, there appears to have been a general failure, and had McClellan, calculating on the chances invariably offered by an enforced retreat, pushed resolutely forward in strong force, success might possibly have followed. Lee, on receiving Pendleton's report, long after midnight, sent off orders for Jackson to drive the enemy back. When the messenger arrived, Jackson had already ridden to the front. He, too, had received news of the capture of the guns, and ordering A.P. Hill and Early, who were in camp near Martinsburg, to march at once to Shepherdstown, he had gone forward to reconnoitre the enemy's movements. When Lee's courier found him, he was on the Shepherdstown road, awaiting the arrival of his divisions, and watching, unattended by a single aide-de-camp, the advance of Porter's infantry. He had at once grasped the situation. The Confederates were in no condition to resist an attack in force. The army was not concentrated. The cavalry was absent. No reconnaissance had been made either of lines of march or of positions. The roads were still blocked by the trains. The men were exhausted by their late exertions and depressed by their retreat, and the straggling was terrible. The only chance of safety lay in driving back the enemy's advanced guard across the river before it could be reinforced, and the chance was seized without an instant's hesitation. The Federals advanced leisurely, for the cavalry, which should have led the way, had received its orders too late to reach the rendezvous at the appointed hour, and the infantry, compelled to reconnoitre for itself, made slow progress. Porter's leading brigade was consequently not more than 1.5 miles from the river when the light division reported to Jackson. Hill was ordered to form his troops in 2 lines, and with Early in close support to move at once to the attack. The Federals, confronted by a large force, and with no further object than to ascertain the whereabouts of the Confederate army, made no attempt to hold their ground. Their left and centre, composed mainly of regulars, withdrew in good order. The right, hampered by broken country, was slow to move, and Hill's soldiers, who had done much at Sharpsburg with but little loss, were confident of victory. The Federal artillery beyond the river included many of their heavy batteries, and when the long lines of the Southerners appeared in the open, they were met by a storm of shells. But without a check, even to close the gaps in the ranks, or to give time to the batteries to reply to the enemy's fire, the light division pressed forward to the charge. The conflict was short. The Northern regulars had already passed the ford, and only a brigade of volunteers was left on the southern bank. Bringing up his reserve regiment, the Federal general made a vain effort to prolong his front. Hill answered by calling up a brigade from his second line, and then, outnumbered and outflanked, the enemy was driven down the bluffs and across the river. The losses in this affair were comparatively small. The Federals reported 340 killed and wounded, and of these a raw regiment, armed with condemned Enfield rifles, accounted for no less than 240. Hill's casualties were 271, yet the engagement was not without importance. Jackson's quick action and resolute advance convinced the enemy that the Confederates were still dangerous, and McClellan, disturbed by Stuart's threat against his rear, abandoned all idea of crossing the Potomac in pursuit of Lee. With Porter's repulse, the summer campaign of 1862 was closed. Begun on the Chickahominy, within 30 miles of Richmond, it ended on the Potomac, within 70 miles of Washington, and 6 months of continuous fighting had brought both belligerents to the last stage of exhaustion. Falling apart like two great battleships of the older wars, the smoke of battle drifting slowerly, hulls rent by round shot, and scuppers awash with blood, but with the colours still flying over shattered spars and tangled shrouds, the armies drew off from the tremendous struggle. Neither Confederates nor Federals were capable of further effort. Lee, gathering in his stragglers, left Stuart to cover his front and fell back towards Winchester. McClellan was content with seizing the Maryland Heights at Harper's Ferry, and except the cavalry patrols, not a single Federal soldier was sent across the river. The organization was absolutely imperative. The Army of the Potomac was in no condition to undertake the invasion of Virginia. Not only had the losses in battle been very large, but the supply train, hurriedly put together after Pope's defeat, had broken down. In every arm there was a great deficiency of horses. The troops, especially those who had been engaged in the peninsula, were half-clad and badly shod, and above all, the army was very far from sharing McClellan's conviction that Sharpsburg was a brilliant victory. The men in the ranks were not so easily deceived as their commander. McClellan, relying on a return drawn up by General Banks, now in command at Washington, estimated the Confederate army at 97,000 men, and his official reports made frequent mention of Lee's overwhelming strength. The soldiers knew better. They had been close enough to the enemy's lines to learn for themselves how thin was the force which manned them. They were perfectly well aware that they had been held in check by inferior numbers, and that the battle on the Antietam, tactically speaking, was no more of a victory for the North than Malvern Hill had been for the South. From dawn to dark on September 18th, they had seen the tattered colours and bright bayonets of the Confederates still covering the Sharpsburg Ridge. They had seen the grey line, immovable and defiant, in undisputed possession of the battleground, while their own guns were silent and their own generals reluctant to renew the fight. Both the government and the people expected McClellan to complete his success by attacking Lee in Virginia. The Confederates, it was said, and men based their opinions on McClellan's reports, had been heavily defeated not only at Antietam but also at South Mountain. And although the Army of the Potomac might be unfit for protracted operations, the condition of the enemy must necessarily be far worse. Such arguments, however, were entirely inapplicable to the situation. The Confederates had not been defeated at all, either at South Mountain or Sharpsburg, and although they had eventually abandoned their positions, they had suffered less than their opponents. The retreat, however, across the Potomac had undoubtedly shaken their morale. In a military point of view, wrote Lee to Davis on September 25th, the best move, in my opinion, the army could make would be to advance upon Hagerstown and endeavour to defeat the enemy at that point. I would not hesitate to make it even with our diminished numbers did the army exhibit its former temper and condition, but as far as I am able to judge, the hazard would be great and reverse disastrous. But McClellan was not more cheerful. The army, he said on the 27th, is not now in a condition to undertake another campaign, nor to bring on another battle, unless great advantages are offered by some mistake of the enemy, or pressing military exigencies render it necessary. So far from thinking of pursuit, he thought only of the defence of the Potomac, apprehending a renewed attempt to enter Maryland, and by no means overconfident that the 2 army corps which he had at last sent to Harper's Ferry would be able to maintain their position if attacked. Nor were the soldiers more eager than their commander to cross swords with their formidable enemy. It would be useless, says General G.H. Gordon, who now commanded a Federal division, to deny that at this period there was a despondent feeling in the army, and the special correspondents of the New York newspapers, The World and Tribune, confirm the truth of this statement. but the clearest evidence as to the condition of the troops is furnished in the numerous reports which deal with straggling. The vice had reached a pitch which is almost inconceivable. Thousands and tens of thousands, Federals as well as Confederates, were absent from their commands. "The states of the North," wrote McClellan, "are flooded with deserters and absentees. One corps of this army has 13,000 men present and 15,000 absent. Of this 15,000, 8,000 probably are at work at home." On September 28th, General Meade, who had succeeded to the command of Hooker's corps, reported that over 8,000 men, including 250 officers, had quit the ranks either before or during the Battle of Antietam, adding that "this terrible and serious evil seems to pervade the whole body." The Confederates, although the privations of the troops during the forced marches, their indifferent equipment, and the deficiencies of the commissariat were contributory causes, had almost as much reason to complain. It is said that in the vicinity of Leesburg alone over 10,000 men were living on the citizens. Jackson's own division, which took into action 1,600 effectives on September 17th and lost 700, had 3,900 present for duty on September 30th. Lawton's division rose from 2,500 to 4,450 during the same period, and the returns show that the strength of Longstreet's and Jackson's corps was only 37,792 on September 22nd, but 52,019 on October 1st. It is thus evident that in 8 days the army was increased by more than 14,000 men, yet only a few conscripts had been enrolled. Lee's official reports and correspondence allude in the strongest terms to the indiscipline of his army. "The absent," he wrote on September 23rd, "are scattered broadcast over the land," and in the dispatches of his subordinates are to be found many references to the vagrant tendencies of their commands. A strong provost guard was established at Winchester for the purpose of collecting stragglers. Parties of cavalry were sent out to protect the farms from pillage and to bring in the marauders as prisoners. The most stringent regulations were issued as to the preservation of order on the march, the security of private property, and the proper performance of their duties by regimental and commissariat officers. On September 23rd, General Jones reported from Winchester that the country was full of stragglers, that he had already sent back 5,000 or 6,000, and that the numbers of officers amongst them was astonishing. The most earnest representations were made to the President, suggesting trial of the offenders by drumhead court-martial, and ordinary police duties became the engrossing occupation of every general officer. It can hardly be said, then, that the Confederates had drawn much profit from the invasion of Maryland. The capture of Harper's Ferry made but small amends for the retreat into Virginia, and the stubborn endurance of Sharpsburg, however remarkable in the annals of war, had served no useful purpose beyond crippling for the time being the Federal army. The battle must be classed with Aspern and Talavera. Lee's soldiers saved their honor, but no more. The facts were not to be disguised. The Confederates had missed their mark. Only a few hundred recruits had been raised in Maryland, and there had been no popular outbreak against the Union government. The Union army had escaped defeat. Lincoln had been able to announce to the Northern people that Lee's victorious career had at length been checked, and 12,000 veteran soldiers, the flower of the Southern army, had fallen in battle. Had General Longstreet's advice been taken and the troops withdrawn across the Potomac after the fall of Harper's Ferry, this enormous loss, which the Confederacy could so ill afford, would certainly have been avoided. Yet Lee was not ill-satisfied with the results of the campaign, nor did Jackson doubt the wisdom of accepting battle on the Antietam. The hazard was great, but the stake was greater. To achieve decisive success in war, some risk must be run. "It is impossible," says Moltke, "to forecast the result of a pitched battle. But this is no reason that pitched battles, if there is a fair prospect of success, should be shirked." And in the Sharpsburg campaign, the Confederates had undoubtedly fair prospects of success. If the lost order had not fallen into McClellan's hands, Lee in all probability would have had ample time to select his battlefield and concentrate his army. There would have been no need of forced marches, and consequently much less straggling. Both Lee and Jackson counted on the caution of their opponent. Both were surprised by the unwanted vigour he displayed, especially at South Mountain and in the march to Sharpsburg. Such resolution in action, they were aware, was foreign to his nature. "I cannot understand this move of McClellan's," was Jackson's remark, when it was reported that the Federal general had boldly advanced against the strong position on South Mountain. But neither Lee nor Jackson was aware that McClellan had exact information of their dispositions, and that the carelessness of a Confederate staff officer had done more for the Union than all the Northern scouts and spies in Maryland. Jackson had been disposed to leave a larger margin for accidents than his commander. He would have left Harper's Ferry alone and have fought the Federals in the mountains, and he was probably right, for in the Gettysburg campaign of the following year, when Lee again crossed the Potomac, Harper's Ferry was ignored, although occupied by a strong garrison, and neither in advance nor retreat were the Confederate communications troubled. But as to the wisdom of giving battle on the Antietam, after the fall of Harper's Ferry, there was no divergence of opinion between Lee and his lieutenant. They had no reason to respect the Union army as a weapon of offence, and very great reason to believe that McClellan was incapable of wielding it. Their anticipations were well founded. The Federal attack was badly designed and badly executed. If it be compared with the German attack at Worth, the defects of McClellan, the defects of his subordinates, the want of sound training throughout the whole army become at once apparent. On August 6, 1870, there was certainly early in the day much disjointed fighting, due in great part to the difficulties of the country, the absence of the Crown Prince, and the anxiety of the generals to render each other loyal support. But when once the commander-in-chief appeared upon the field, and, assuming direction of the battle, infused harmony into the operations, the strength and unity of the attack could hardly have been surpassed. Almost at the same moment, 30,000 men were launched against McMahon's front, 25,000 against his right, and 10,000 against his left. Every battalion within sound of the cannon participated in the forward movement, and numerous batteries, crossing the stream which corresponds with the Antietam, supported the infantry at the closest range. No general hesitated to act on his own responsibility. Everywhere there was cooperation between infantry and artillery, between division and division, between army corps and army corps, and such cooperation, due to a sound system of command, is the characteristic mark of a well-trained army and a wise leader. At Sharpsburg, on the other hand, there was no combination whatever, and even the Army Corps commanders dared not act without specific orders. There was nothing like the close concert and the aggressive energy which had carried the Southerners to victory at Gaines's Mill and the Second Manassas. The principle of mutual support was utterly ignored. The Army Corps attacked in succession and not simultaneously, and in succession they were defeated. McClellan fought 3 separate battles, from dawn to 10 a.m. against Lee's left, from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. against his centre, from 1 to 4 p.m. against his right. The subordinate generals, although, with a few exceptions, they handled their commands skillfully, showed no initiative, and waited for orders instead of improving the opportunity. Only 2/3 of the army was engaged. 25,000 men hardly fired a shot, and from first to last there was not the slightest attempt at cooperation. McClellan was made aware by his signallers on the Red Hill of every movement that took place in his opponent's lines, and yet he was unable to take advantage of Lee's weakness. He had still to grasp the elementary rule that the combination of superior numbers and of all arms against a single point is necessary to win battles.